I'm Neil Doherty with North Country Whitetails, and welcome to DSI. You know, for years you've been reading about big bucks and some of the stories behind how they're harvested, but you never really got a full picture. In DSI, we're going to break it down in great detail and really give you the behind-the-scenes talk and understanding why deer do what they do. We're going to merge the deer stories with the science behind how the deer move, the food sources in the area, get up above and study aerial photography and really teach you how to use those techniques when it comes to your hunts this fall. This is the story of the Cringe buck. I first met Jim about 5 years ago when he hired me to come into his property and put together a layout plan that would help hold deer on his property and help him achieve his goals of generating 3-year-old or older deer for hunting opportunities on his farm. Property is set up in broken ag country, but really what was striking to me about the piece of property when I first showed up, it was part of a pretty decent funnel, and we expected a lot of neighborhood deer to transition in the property as they drifted into some fields that he would plant in the future. Now overall, the property has been managed quite well for the last 4 years. As a matter of fact, Jim has planted everything that you could imagine. If it could be picked up in a landscape store somewhere, it's planted out in the property. There's warm season native grasses planted along the edge of these open fields to help block the visibility for deer that are feeding out there. It makes them feel more comfortable. There's numbers of small apple trees and other fruit producing trees that are scattered throughout these grassy fields that are now producing fruit. There's also some small hunting food plots that have been introduced and planted in a mixture of clover and chicory, complete with evergreen trees moving through the middle of the fields to again break up the overall outline. This is kind of landscape design for whitetails at its finest, using every inch of a piece of property to promote a piece of property. Again, it's going to use up a lot of time from deer as they move around the piece of ground with lots of unique habitats and unique types of foods. In addition to planting some of the smaller fields, this large ag field here is dominated by some corn and alfalfa that's planted annually and left standing for the deer to use during the winter months. Now, one of the most striking features that popped out to me 5 years ago when I visited Jim's property was the fact that there was already the makings of a pretty incredible funnel on the piece of property that we needed to break down a little bit more to make it more productive for bow hunting. In this case, there's a large swamp that has been opened up with several duck ponds, but this marshy, nasty, grassy area really isn't good deer habitat. They're going to work along the edges of that, but they have a very wide piece of terrain that they can pass through in this funnel as they travel off the property from the north, heading south and heading back into his food sources that he has planted here. The trick for Jim to be successful is to try to create some funnels and some breaks here that are going to make the deer, force them to go to specific locations. So instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different tree strands to try to hunt the deer through this funnel, we can narrow it down by creating blocks using natural vegetation and natural features in the forest to force the deer to specific locations. Now, 5 years ago, I described a technique called hinge cutting to Jim. Hinge cutting is where you simply cut 3/4 of the way through about a 4-inch diameter tree and allow it to tip over. And you're going to cut it about 4 feet off the ground, so about waist high. And that tree, combined with other trees cut, helps to create kind of a living fence or living barrier to deer as they move across and encounter now this wall of trees that's down. On the positive side also with hinge cutting is it continues to live because you're leaving the stem of the tree connected to the top of the tree through that little bit of a hinge. Now, Jim is kind of a purist when it comes to timber, and he was really kind of shocked with that technique, and he called it cringe cutting and didn't want to use it, and he came to visit us at our research facility, and once he saw it in action and saw how well the deer used these as a food source as well as how they funneled around them, he quickly went back and put a lot of sweat equity into his property and cut several locations for hinge cuts. Primarily one off the edge of this food plot here, a secondary hinge cut location right here, and also a third location of hinge cut. All 3 of these locations designed to help force the deer into a funnel as they headed out towards this particular food plot. So lots of off-season work to really make the deer go where specifically we want them to go. Now, as we fast forward into the Cringe buck and the story behind the Cringe buck, a lot of it has to do with his overall landscape design as to why he was successful. He had photographed a good buck using one of the travel corridors heading out to this field earlier in the year. And he only had one picture of this deer. It was a unique deer with multiple times coming off the beam. He definitely knew it was a targeted buck he wanted to hunt. And really what he wanted to do, because the buck wasn't showing up in a predictable pattern, he kind of let things settle down and waited for the rut to get this buck moving. Probably the buck was bedding in some of the thickets or some of the sanctuaries where he had, but he didn't have a good read on it, and he didn't pressure the buck until the rut started to kick in. As we approached the second week of November, it really hit what we call the hunter's rut. There was deer moving, bucks crossing the roads and other places. It was kind of that prime time that we always hope for. And he jumped in and started to hunt his tree stand locations that were centered in between his hinge cutting locations. Now, Jim likes to keep the pressure off. Again, the deer are feeding in these fields, and in the early morning hours, they're going to be drifting back up through his funnel setups. It's nearly impossible for you to get in between those deer from the fields to their bedding areas in the early morning without spooking them from the parking area currently where it is. So he limits his hunting exposure to hunting in the evenings and tries to catch the deer as they move from the north, the bedding areas, and heading to the food locations. The overall time period when he was hunting in these funnel locations, he was averaging about 4 or 5 bucks per evening sit as the bucks passed through there. It was really prime time, lots of good rutting activity. And his second night in there hunting, this multiple time buck, the Cringe buck, came through. It presented a shot at about 30 yards. He was unsure of the shot, and he made the right decision. He passed the deer and let it go. Fast forward a couple more days. It's a northwest wind. The wind was traveling across the farm in a northwest direction, set up perfectly for his archery location right off the edge of one of these brush piles. He showed up in the stand about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and as we started to run out of daylight, as typically happens, the big boy came through, and he was heading out to try to work the initial food plot here, the small staging food plot, and probably ultimately would have ended up out in the big ag field out in the standing corn by the time it was an hour or two after dark. The buck encountered the edge of the hinge cut, and just like clockwork, funneled right along the edge and moved right along the edge, feeding a little bit on the nips of the edges of the young trees, and presented himself with a 12-yard shot that Jim was able to successfully pull off. So he had totally affected his destiny in terms of hunting success here on this property by spending the time in the off-season and devoting a couple days to cutting trees and creating some funnels. So when he was finally, that big buck was moving back and forth between the feeding areas and the bedding areas, he only had 1 or 2 options that he could move through, and Jim was properly situated right in the middle of those funnels. Now we can make a good success story even a little bit better. Fast forward a week later, the opening of the gun season, and look at this dynamite 12-pointer that he killed 20 yards away from the original tree stand as he moved through, again, that same funnel.